I think the first thing that we want to talk about for a second that I feel like we've said on here a lot before, but it's like, I feel like it's going to give you like the foundation to understand where we go with everything else, which is Megan's philosophy that anything that has more than 2 steps needs a process. Which initially sounds crazy and control freakish. But once you are actually operating that way in the business, and we'll give you a lot of examples, it is so wild how much of a difference that makes. And we're going to talk through a lot of the structures and processes that we have, but we have them because we operate off that philosophy. And that's just really important. I think a lot of times we're questioning ourselves in business, like, does that need a process? Do I need to systematize this? Do I not? And like, that's the only filter we use. Does it have more than 2 steps? And that's why shit operates like a freaking well-oiled machine in our business because of that. Hey, Lisa. Yes, Michelle likes your philosophy. Lauren said, I'm figuring this out right now. Totally. Mandy needs to remember that. Yeah. Listen, it's a hard fought lesson, I think. But Megan, do you want to expand on that at all?
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things where like, I kind of almost feel like sometimes we like to lean into having like too many systems versus not enough, because I feel like if you don't need them, you don't need to use them or don't need to like update them. But I feel like so often the systems that we have set up and the processes that we have like only become more and more useful over time and as we grow. So like I'm super grateful now of like Megan from 4 years ago who started this philosophy. Because like as you continue to grow and as you continue to expand and as you bring on more team members and all of that, it just makes it that much easier for everyone involved if you do start to have some of these processes. So even if you don't have a team right now and it's just you completing everything, I still really stand by the philosophy of like, if it has more than 2 steps, start writing down, even if it's not like super detailed and super, like built out process or anything, just start writing down the steps that you're taking and things like that, because it just makes it that much easier and more streamlined for the future too.
And you don't know that you need it until you really need it. It's kind of a point. Like we had a team member this year who I think she'd been with us for 4 or 5 years, move on to explore other opportunities. And thank God that was documented so well. And it would have been so easy not to have that documented super well because she'd been with us for so long, like that we could have gotten away with that for literally 4 or 5 years, But the reason we were able to pretty easily like onboard someone else is solely because of that. And we were, even when we were like talking to new people, we were able to be like, here are the exact tasks, here are the process, here's what it looks like. Are you going to be able to fit into that and make it work? So it's one of those things where like, it doesn't feel like an immediately beneficial thing. So we don't usually like, innately do it, but it is the stuff that will bite you in the ass so hard later if you don't.
Totally. And it's one of those things where like, once you're at the point of needing someone to help with like systems and stuff like that, or once you feel like you need systems in your business, it's kind of like you probably should have started documenting things a long time ago, because it's that much harder to kind of like backlog things and get things set up once you're at that point where you're like, I really need like all this structure and support and stuff. And so if you do kind of adopt some of these philosophies and systems early, then it just makes it that much easier in the long term.
Right. So like we run a 7-figure business now, but off of systems we built, like Megan said, 3 or 4 years ago, like those stood the test of time. And certainly we've had to like upgrade certain things that we do or change certain things as any business would have to. But like, I think that's the point, is sometimes it's almost like we're waiting to get to the money before we build the business that supports it. And instead, it's like the way you get to the money is building a business that's ready to support that long before you're making that. So let's get specific with some different things. One thing that I talk about a lot that I feel like everyone's like, wait, what? How do I get my team to do that? That is so like, I think the backbone of how we operate together is that we have like Megan and Lacey processes, and then we have Megan and team processes or systems. And seeing it like that is really important, because what I see happen, and Megan, I think you could say this too, is like too many business owners get involved in every single system and process of their business. And it's so easy for it to get so overwhelming. And I think that's why a lot of people don't lean into systems as much, or just want to like, what's that saying? Like throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of thing. But there are ways that Megan and I have systems and communicate. And then there are completely separate ways that Megan and team have systems and communicate. And that is life-changing, because Megan is like, what I always joke about is like, I speak English, the team speaks French, and Megan is bilingual, right? So Megan and I speak English in our channels. Megan and the team speak French in their channels. And the team doesn't have to like try to discern what Lacey means by this high level thought process she's having. And I don't have to discern what team means when they're like, do you want us to like, whatever, put it into this funnel and active campaign or that funnel? I'm like, ugh. So we'll talk about like what that looks like, but I think it's just really important to say like that could be different. Yeah, everyone wants examples. Totally. Yes. Anyway, Megan, do you want to say more on that?
Yeah, I think that it's like one of those things too, where I am like a very systems oriented person. Like that's how my brain functions. And so it is really easy for me to be in that kind of like translator role, where I can kind of like have the higher level conversations with you, where we're kind of talking like big picture, and I can immediately see, here's what we would need to do to go through that. And so then I can kind of like translate that into the processes for the team to follow. And I think that that allows for you to not have to be in that brain space where like, it's not something where you're needing to break down like, okay, this is what like every team member needs to do, and this is what like the details need to look like. And it kind of allows you to really keep in that like visionary arena, right?
Yes, I also think it keeps me from having to, what's the word I want to use? Have to be really careful with everything I share. Because I think if you have like, 7, 9, 10, or even 3 or 2 or 1 or whatever members on your team, if the way I talk with Megan could not be the way that I like got that out to team. So I'll say to Megan, like, I'm thinking about this. I have this idea. Maybe we'll do this. So I can be like casual and off the cuff, and we can stay in good communication, because I'm not waiting until I have this like fully fledged, fully thought through, absolutely certain I want to go with it idea. So what it really helps with is like us being able to communicate more effectively, because Megan is able to kind of get like the raw like ideas, and I don't have to filter myself. Like I can send her a quick 2-minute message, as opposed to like, having to wait until I have this like, 40-minute block of time to be able to really effectively communicate this plan. And so I think that's really important for me too, is I don't feel like I have to be a huge filter. And then Alessia said like she thinks it's like really genius, especially as an introvert. And I think that's true too, because the other thing we have to remember is like, I'm also talking to a shit ton of clients every day, not only on session, but in Basecamp. And so you got to think about this in your own business, is like, if you're talking to a ton of clients, plus you're talking to multiple team members, plus you're on multiple calls, like your brain will just start getting it wrong. It will like overload. Do you know what I mean? So that's a really important piece too, which is why I really try to stay out of all the details, because my job has to be in using that amount of brain space for clients and for those details, as opposed to for all the details of like who's sending what email when kind of thing. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Separating the visionary and integrator. Totally. Hey, Julia. Yes, here we are. We were a little bit late, so that might have been why. So one of the things we do to do this that I personally love is that Megan gives me to-dos, and I think I don't see a lot of business owners and their team operating like this. And you guys have probably heard me talk about this before too, but like, and I treat those very fucking seriously. And so it feels like Megan's responsible for moving the project forward, and I'm responsible for doing my pieces of that to make sure it moves forward. Does that feel true, Megan?
100%. Yeah. Like we always kind of like have a process of like talking through what the project is. And then we break it down into like what's on your plate versus what's team to execute and all of that. And then I will assign Lacey to-dos and due dates and say like, here's what we need from you and here's when we need it by in order to move the rest of things forward. And I think what is so valuable is that like you are so good at basically like always making sure that that's a priority, because you know that there are like 10 other things that are kind of happening after and dependent on that. And so like if you miss a due date, all of these other things have to get moved around and reworked and all of that. And so to be able to have like everyone kind of showing up and like doing their pieces of the process like on time and the due dates that we're coming up with for everything, it just makes it so that everything functions and moves forward really smoothly.
Totally. And it makes it so we're all moving forward as a team. The other thing I see happen in some businesses is like the OBM or integrator or COO or whatever will go have a conversation with the CEO, and then we'll go give a project plan to everyone else, but they're not giving to-dos back to the CEO. So the CEO is like almost on their own plan and their own timeline, and they're figuring out what pieces they need to do and they're deciding on when, which is completely disjointed from the team that's over here figuring those out. So the reason we do that and have her give me like the to-dos and the deadlines and whatever isn't because I'm like, I'm a helpless child, I don't know what I'm supposed to do and when. It's because we need to all be on the same page and working together and having a project plan that fits together, as opposed to me being off on whatever tangent. Oh, Gwen wants to know what project management platforms we use. We'll totally answer that, Gwen. But that's really important. And then also like having that mutual respect of like, that's Megan's role. So it's my job to like follow her deadlines and not question that. Again, I think that sometimes as the CEO, like, yes, you're in charge, but like, if you have hired someone to be in charge of the project management, let them fucking be in charge of that. And I think there's just such a fine line there of like fully giving up your power versus in really like empowering your team to do their role. That's how you get good systems.
And just also like how everything continues to like play off of it, like everything else, right? Where like, I feel like when systems start to feel like they're not working is when it feels really disjointed, or when like things keep falling through the cracks, or like things do keep kind of like having to move around and all over the place and stuff. And so if you do kind of just all really see it as like, as a team, we are moving the needle forward on this. I think that that's what really like allows things to just function really well. And then that's what allows you to see that like the system is really supporting the entire business as a whole to keep moving forward. And it also helps with like each individual person to kind of like clarify like their lane, their expectations, what like what's expected of like their tasks and they're kind of piece of the puzzle within each system too.
Yes. Sorry, my pen's dying. I'm trying to write down project management systems so we can share what those are too. But Hannah asked a question that I think we'll answer before we get into that, which is relevant to this, which is, what if you as the CEO are sometimes the bottleneck because of overwhelm? Does that mean you have to outsource more? I think it means you have to take more off your plate, honestly. Maybe that's outsource more, but I think sometimes it might just be reset expectations. I think that there have certainly been a couple times in business where I've bordered really close to that. And I've had to go to Megan and say, I'm about to bottleneck every process we have going on here. Like, what needs to go? And we've had to, just decide like, okay, so this cool thing that we were going to do isn't going to happen. This other idea isn't going to happen. Like, we're getting back to basics kind of thing of just like our absolute non-negotiables. So, yeah, I think that there is this way where sometimes as CEOs, we really overpromise or overestimate what we think we can do. And I think there's, Megan, you tell me, but there's almost nothing more frustrating for a team than that, because they can't build processes that don't get followed. So if we're consistently not following a process, something relatively drastically has to change. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. And I think like sometimes that can just almost be like changing due dates of like, cool, we're still going to move forward on this project that we're wanting to work on, but we need to extend the timeline by like another month in order to create that space for it, because for whatever reason. But I think like it is just about kind of adjusting. Something needs to get adjusted. So sometimes that might just be like delegating more, and it might not even be like, it might be in like a different area that you don't really think about or something. It could be taking on less and kind of like saying, well, we're not going to like move forward on this project. We're just going to shelf it. Or it could just be like extending timelines. Like, I think it can look very different, but it is something that you do want to try to make adjustments, because that's how, like, you want to make sure that the systems you are putting in place are really moving forward, and that your team really feels supported in like their end of the process too, that like it makes it that much, it makes it so much easier for them to be able to like plan their time, plan their schedule, get things done, within like their due dates, if things are coming, like being done by the due date from the CEO as well.
Yeah, totally. Okay. I wrote down a bunch of questions because things were disappearing.
Okay.
Julia is building a team right now. So she said like any team building advice on almost like an agency side. And I would say like same thing here that we're talking about is like have a system for everything with more than 2 steps, and have different client communication than agency communication. So it's like Megan and Lacey have a different system than Megan and team. And I think that's really important. Elisa says, what would be the first systems and processes you would put into place in a business?
I think typically the first one is usually around content and marketing. So like basically, I think we've talked about this before, but like trying to think of like your money-making activities and like, especially like repeatable things, which for most of us in the online space, a lot of that is like social media, content marketing, like that kind of stuff. And so setting up systems around that. I also think that that's like a really easy place to then delegate to teams. So if you have a really strong system for it, that makes it so that like you have a good system that you're able to be really consistent. It's going to be easier to pass to team, and it starts to like snowball, right? Where like the more consistent you are with marketing, the more kind of like results you're going to start to build over time. And so I think that that's probably the first kind of like foundational thing that I typically recommend.
Totally agree with that. I think, whatever the thing is, it's like the backbone of your business, if that, which is probably content. If you have an online business, that's the first thing that gets systematized. And then almost like knowing your priorities in terms of what makes your business thrive, and then systematizing back from there. So then the next thing might be like client service. Like, do you have a way that you're like, whatever. So anyway, like you almost like know the answer based on what makes your business thrive. Right.
100%.
Okay. Shari said, which we could probably talk about more in depth later, but we can give you the quick and dirty. She said, like, how did you pull off the NFT launch over the holidays while still, you know, like taking time off, respecting humans? And the honest truth is I did a lot more than I normally would. And I was willing to do that. Like, this is where we just play with trade-offs in our business. Like, I would never, ever, ever go to my team and be like, hey, I have this idea and it's the holidays, but I want you guys to get it done in whatever, a week. And I know some of you are off and blah, blah. But what I will do is say, hey, I have this idea and I want to pull it off. And so because of that, I'm willing to take the trade-off of doing like the lion's share of this myself. And then I would just need this piece and this piece from you. Is that cool? And I easily could have waited too. Like, I could have been like, we can't execute this to have a January 1st launch. And that would have been fine too. But I was just really excited about it. And so it felt good for me to do most of it. And also because it was such like a new idea, it made sense for most of that to come from me anyway. But I think this is where we as business owners get ourselves tripped up, because we think like we should be able to have this like big idea like that and it should get executed in the easiest, most pleasurable fashion without us having to like every now and then make a trade-off or pour ourselves into the thing or whatever. And like, yeah, it was a trade-off that felt worth it for me at the time. And then team did what they could do. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, Megan, but.
Yeah. Well, and I think that it was like, there weren't a lot of aspects that needed to get done on our end during the Christmas break. So it was like, you know, that wasn't much of a commitment on our end. And so most of it was like, this is just reprioritizing things in January. And so that was the conversation more or less of like, cool, like we were planning on X, Y, and Z. So we would just need to move these things around in January instead. Right. Yeah. So it was almost like more of a conversation of like just shifting tasks, projects, priorities for January, and knowing that like majority of kind of like the heavy lifting was actually going to be done by Lacey.
Yeah. And I think it's really important as business owner to not feel bad about that, but as team member to not feel bad about that. Because Megan, like, it's not Megan's job to like fix that almost, you know, like, but I feel like some service providers like that are still new or are like working on boundaries would feel like, oh shit, like, how can I help? How can I do this? Do you need me to step in? And like, I think you have been in this long enough to know that's Lacey's problem if she wants to run with this kind of thing. Like
have fun.
It, right? And I think it's just a beautiful mutual respect thing where I know Megan respects her own boundaries and I respect hers and vice versa. And so I think that that's just, that's like growth that we've had over time together. Okay, so, hold on. Let me just answer this because it fits together and then I'll jump back. But Shari said follow-up is, did you ask them about capacity or just take it on first and give them the minimum knowing their capacity? I mean, I pretty much already knew team capacity and I already knew like when Megan was working and when she wasn't and all of that kind of stuff. I think the only thing I did differently there is I tried to give them as much lead time as possible. So like if I knew like we wanted this thing live on the 31st, I really, really made sure that I did my own push to not give it to Megan on the 31st or whatever. Like I tried to give it to her, like, you know, Christmas Eve or whatever. I can't even remember. Not because she needed to do it on Christmas Eve, but because I wanted her to be able to do it whenever she wanted to do it that week kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So next question was, do we use the same platform for team communication versus me and you communication. And then someone also asked project management and systems. So you could probably just answer both of those together.
Cool. So I like to keep them separate. I think it's really useful in a lot of ways, but like also just from a tool standpoint, I think that the separate tools that we use do kind of like function differently. So we use on the client side, so Lacey and I use Basecamp, and then that's what I also use with any of my other clients. And that's kind of what we use from our perspective for any like chatting, to-dos, documents, all of that. And then with our team, I use Teamwork, which is a little bit, it's kind of like ClickUp basically, or Asana, but it's what we've been using for quite a long, like 4 or 5 years. And so like, we just have like all of our systems built into that. And what I like about that is that it kind of like keeps everything almost like segmented a little bit more. And Teamwork and any like more like task oriented, like task focused project management system is going to be better with team, where like you're giving like recurring to-dos and like all of that. I don't think Basecamp just has made some updates, but I don't think Basecamp is as good for like assigning to-dos, especially with like a lot of projects and stuff like that. So that's kind of what
I love how they've done the recurring to-dos actually. Yeah.
Yeah.
And
you were like, can you not?
Yeah.
I set it up and you're like, oh, I actually hate this.
Like,
Please
I hate
undo.
that. Let's never do that again. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And that's easier for me too, as the business owner. The same place that I go to communicate with clients is the same place I go to communicate with team, Basecamp. And that makes my life significantly easier because there's like one place that I work, if that makes sense. So, and that also makes it so I can be really on top of responding to team. Like responding to Megan is a huge, huge, huge priority in my day every day, but it's made easier because it's in the one place that I already go for other things. So I think that helps too. Like that's something I really recommend for my clients is like, how can the point person on your team be communicating with you in the place that you're already doing a lot of communicating, you know? Okay. Someone wanted to know, Megan, for you, like, you're obviously more of like a visionary in your own business, but like an integrator in other businesses. And like, how does that work for you? Or how do you see that role? And how do you kind of like bridge the two?
Yeah, so that's interesting too, because I feel like it's something that I've learned over time. Like I really started only in kind of the integrator role, well, VA first into OBM, into kind of like COO and all of that. And so I feel like that was kind of like the first part of the trajectory. And then that shifted into then also kind of building the white space side of my business and training, doing more templates and training team members and all of that kind of stuff. And so I feel like it was kind of over several years that happened. It wasn't like I started my business and I have these two kind of like things that I'm balancing. So I think that that's kind of an important thing. I kind of separate it almost like I almost see white space, like my business and kind of like that side of things, as a separate client in my mind, kind of, where like I almost like am just like treating myself as another space, like a client space. And so I basically kind of do all of the same processes that I do with all of my other clients, but like with my own business and that kind of side of things.
And you've really spent time over the years creating time to treat yourself as a client. I think that's where a lot of people get tripped up, is they fill up their client load and then don't have time to treat themselves as a client, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Okay. The next one was Lindsay asked, like, what were things we systematized and things we didn't? And we wanted to get into that a little bit. So that was perfect. So we systematized pretty much like everything, like Megan was saying, from like content repurposing to our podcast, to client onboarding and offboarding, to like our sales processes, to when we launch programs, like everything. And I'm talking like down to nitty gritty detail. So this is just a stupid example I'll give, but like, I like to post, the morning content every day in this group as an example, because I feel more connected when I do that. Obviously I don't have to do that. Team could do that for me, but it is like a personal practice that I really enjoy in my business. So we have all the content in one place, but we have a system where it's like Lacey posts in the morning and she highlights it green. And then someone from team posts in the afternoon. And when they post, they highlight it green. Like it's such a little thing. And it's like 2 steps of like, Lacey hits copy, paste, post, highlight screen. Like it's so small, but it has caught so many things over the years of like, Lacey forgot to post. So team grabbed that one and saved it for next time, or team forgot to post. And so I grabbed that one. And like, it just really creates like a lot of ease, or I'm not like, wait, which number post was I supposed to post next? And then I have to fucking message Megan, who then has to go check who that, like, it's just like those little itty bitty things that we've added systems to over the years has been so helpful. And again, that's just such a small example, but that is the level of detail we try to go to in our team because it makes everyone's life so much easier. I can't even remember the last time we've had to have a conversation about like what didn't get or what needed to get posted when, because we just fucking highlight it. Like it's that like small and easy, right? Go ahead.
I think that that's just like a really good example too, because I think that a lot of times people think about systems and think almost like it has to be this really complex thing. Yes, and like tons of like I like tons of steps or tons of like tools. Like we use Google Drive, like it's a Google Doc, you know, and
yes.
It's just like very, very simple. And I think that that's why it works so well, because we're not overcomplicating it, because we just keep it very kind of like basic level and we just clarify what the system, like what that process is. Then everyone who's involved knows what that process is. And so there's not really any confusion. And there's also not anything where we need to be constantly like updating or changing anything, because we have it at such like a very simple and basic level.
And also like notice how it's easy for us to almost do that for like, how do I want to say it? Like create the process for ourselves, but not communicate that. Like, so maybe like it would be easy for me to be like, oh, every time I post something, I just like highlight it pink because to me, then I know blah, blah, blah. But like, then that would actually confuse team who is coming in, because they would be like, well, what does the pink thing mean? And do I use that one? Do I not? So it's like that idea we talked about earlier of like, everyone is on the same page. If I'm going to highlight something pink from now on, I'm going to tell Megan and Megan's going to like communicate that out. And so that's really what we mean by like systems and structures. It's more like really simple things that everyone is on the same page with. And then, so that's the content bundle that we're going to give away today. So if anybody, wants that, like we go through every system of content. I was mentioning our podcast is something that we have really, really systematized, because if you haven't, it's a little side note, but if you haven't ever done a podcast, they actually require quite a lot of steps and are quite a fucking lot of work, in terms of like, who has to touch it, where it has to go, where it has to be uploaded. Like everyone on our team touches the podcast, right? Because it needs like graphics, it needs editing, it needs content. So that one's like a really big one, for example, but like there is such a clear cut process there, and it looks the same every single week, like week over week, from what happens when I start recording it to what Google Drive folder I put it in, to how I label it, to when I need to get like my part of the clip-ins recorded by, all the way to like how many times a week we promote it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, like I think like a podcast system is a little bit more of a complex system, just because there are more steps. There's more, like you said, more people who need to touch it, like more people involved, more things that need to happen, but we still keep it really streamlined and really simple in that sense and like still keep everything in Google Drive. And I do have I have 2 different templates on my website around this, but like the podcast marketing one is kind of what we're talking about. Where like, basically like we have like a really good process of like how we organize everything on the back end, but then also like, how are we tying it into our marketing plan? How many times are we promoting it? What are we using to promote each episode? And so like, it kind of piggybacks off of our content repurposing and content plans too, and kind of everything ties together.
Something I want to add here too is that like, I'm going to say this in a funny way, but like, we'll pretty much do whatever the fuck it takes to make sure the system works well. And so like, this is just an example, but it's like, when we were in season 5 of the podcast, just like different things had happened. Like, I think Eric and I took like a month break, plus we had the holidays, plus our podcast editor was like going on vacation and taking time off, and he only works certain days. It doesn't matter. But the point is, like, in order for this to successfully get done by the whole team in the amount of time we needed, what I needed to do personally was to record podcast clip-ins, like the clip-ins that I do, and literally to record them same day that I recorded an episode every time for, I don't know, like a couple months or something. And we just try to make the system a priority, as opposed to like, I'm not saying you as the CEO can't be a priority, but I'm saying like everything can't revolve around that sometimes. So like, would it have been easier for my life if I didn't have to record clip-ins the same day? Honestly, significantly. Was it worth sacrificing that for 2 fucking months to not have to like throw an entire system in our business off for the long term? Absolutely. So that's something I just want to say too, where it's like, your systems are built to really serve you, but sometimes you might have to serve them a little bit for certain periods of time, whether that means getting it set up or getting through a tough time crunch like that or whatever. But I think like the first thing most business owners do is throw out the system or throw out the process. And so I just wanted to use that as an example of like, that should be just about the last thing you're doing if you want to keep working like a well-oiled machine long-term. Mm-hmm. And also you need a team member, and Megan, you can speak to this, that's willing to ask you to do that. Like, I so appreciate that Megan will come to me and be like, hey, you can say no to this, but here's what would make everything a lot easier. Like, you need someone that's willing to be that honest with you.
100%. And I think it's one of those things where like, especially with something when you do have a system and you can see the things that would get thrown off by not having that, it becomes a lot more of a priority where you're like, nope, we're sticking with the system. Like we will like be inconvenienced for a short period of time in order to get this moving, to keep this going, because it's almost more work and more of an inconvenience to throw it out and kind of like mess all of that stuff up, you know?
100%. Yes, Gwen says a podcast really is so much work. It really is. I feel like it's very misleading. I try to be like very vocal about that. Like, definitely do a podcast, but holy fuck, be prepared. Elisa wants to know, when is the date for the new season? It's March, right?
Yes. I want to say it's like early or mid-March.
It's March. Yeah. Yes, exactly. Lauren, flexibility. Alessia, they're right next to each other, said, I'm getting it set up now for my content. It's a lot of work, but so satisfying when it's done in advance. Exactly that. Totally. Like, and I think that that's where systems throw people, because it's so much work to set up sometimes, you know, like all of the things we're talking about took a tremendous amount of time, energy, money, effort, like to get set up. But it's like that short-term versus long-term thinking that makes all the difference. Mm-hmm. Okay. So next thing we wanted to talk about was like that we've systematized is client onboarding and offboarding, as well as our sales processes. And we'll just talk about both of those really quick, but like, the thing with like client onboarding and offboarding is like, ours is not super complicated at all. Again, But there's such a clear step by step to it each time. Where like, quite honestly, we could probably operate without that, but it would be just a little bit harder on everyone every time. Because it's so simple that like it almost doesn't need a system, if that makes sense. But that's why we give it one, because then it gets easier for everyone. So like, I know, like I tell Megan, when someone's coming on, she sends this link, we send a gift within X amount of time. We, send then like a follow-up within X amount of time after that. Like, I mean, we don't have to go through the whole process, but the point is like, it's something that for us is relatively easy because we're just onboarding like one client. It would be so easy to say, that's so simple. Like, we really don't need a thing. But those are the things that we try to like double down on.
And I think it's one of those things where like you almost like don't really see like the full value until later. So like one of the steps is like, we basically like update a spreadsheet and like update like name, email, start date, like all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then the more that we found so many more uses for the spreadsheet, and like for like, oh, that's really useful to have this spreadsheet with the updated client list for so many more reasons than just the initial reason we started doing it. And so sometimes it's like that small stuff too, where like having a system like that kind of continues to benefit you in ways that you almost like don't even necessarily realize that it is. And so but like a spreadsheet's really easy to like, oh, I forgot to add this person to the spreadsheet or something. And so like a lot of times
you stop using it and it gets
exactly because like, oh, this isn't up to date anymore. So like, and then it becomes almost like a project that you have to like go in and update the spreadsheet, like, because you haven't updated it for 6 months or something, right?
Totally. Elisa has a question on that, so we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, Satya said her word of the year is systems. That's so awesome. You should definitely check out Megan's like templates for that. Michelle says, yeah, it reduces a lot of decision fatigue, especially for simple ones. Exactly. Because you still have to make the decision, even if it's a simple decision. And so anything that stops you from making decisions is really important. Okay, so Elisa's question was, sometimes I create a system for something in my business, but later realize that it's harder to keep the system alive than the payoff of the system. Am I maybe just overcomplicating things? I think like what I would say is probably, it's almost like the example Megan just used of like, I think sometimes if it's like taking so much work to keep it alive because we're like forgetting to do it and then have to go back and update it and then forgot again. And like that kind of like back and forth, I think it does feel like it's not worth it sometimes. So I would think about like, are you creating systems that you can actually keep up with and that are expecting reasonable things of you to do? Because that's where I think the disconnect comes in. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. And I also think it's almost like kind of circling back to like the question that we had earlier about the bottleneck thing of like looking at it of like, what are just kind of the bare things that I need from this system, and not like, sure, there might be extra steps and extra like things to add on, but like maybe you don't start with those things. Maybe you have like a really bare bones system. And then like once you have a team that can help you with some more aspects, you can add on to it and kind of build it out more. But I don't like, if you're not keeping up with it, it's probably kind of like looking at like, what are just the bare bones things that I absolutely need from this versus like the ideal, like someday system, right?
Totally. I think that's so true. And like Megan said, like, I feel like people think that like we must use like really complicated tools or whatever, but like almost all of our systems are built in Google Drive. Like, so that's another thing too. Like if you're having to open like multiple systems and blah, 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 then like, yeah, I think it can be too much sometimes. So that's another thing. Okay. So the last question was, Ovi had asked like, she knows that like I always mention that I have a control thing. So how do I deal with like my control mindset around this and like delegating so much? And to me, systems make me feel in control because I know what's happening. So it's much easier to delegate. I think the scariest thing in the world, kidding, not kidding, is when you're delegating, but you have absolutely no fucking idea how that's going to work or get accomplished. So the reason this really like fits with that without me being like a micromanager is because I get the system. So like, I trust the system, if that makes sense. So it's like, you know, whatever, like the system for repurposing content. I don't need to look at that all the time. I don't see that all the time, but like, I very much trust like the principle and the steps of what we've built into that. So that's what's easy for me to let go. You're a control freak too, Megan. I don't know what you think.
I know. No, I feel the same way. Like, I feel like it's almost like because the system gives you like the structure. And so you just trust that like the system will support things moving forward. And like the system will make a lot of decisions, right? So it's not like the system kind of guides so much and kind of minimizes room for interpretation and error and all of that. So I think that like when you have a system like that, it makes it so that it's almost like you just trust that that structure is continuing to support you.
And I think this is why a lot of business owners, quite honestly, find it hard to grow, and especially find it hard to grow to like multiple 6 and 7 figures, is because they don't feel that trust in their systems. And so they're so scared that like, you know, one too many things is going to like break their business. But I feel like we were saying, we've been building these systems for a long time. So there's never, ever been a conversation where we're like, oh my God, we can't handle this if we like get more or make more or have more team, or like, it has always felt very like manageable. And so that's why this is so important too, because if you don't feel like you have systems and structures that you can trust in your business, consciously or subconsciously, you're probably going to be pushing that growth away.
Yeah, 100%.
Shari says, what's something unexpected you delegated as you grew that maybe felt weird at first, but you're so grateful now? Something unexpected. I think, it sounds kind of weird to say because it's like not my favorite thing, but I think even just like delegating that Megan gives me to-dos and deadlines as opposed to being responsible for that, because for me, like, it's so important that I like stay in my CEO role and feel really empowered, and I'm not like, because you know how like there's a way to do that where you're like, I just don't know what I'm doing, so like, here, can you just tell me what to do and I'll do it? I hate that vibe. That's like not my vibe at all. So I think there was like resistance there initially because I don't want to put my business on Megan's shoulders, and obviously again, control freak, that doesn't feel good to me. But now it's like the best thing I've ever done. So I think like if you would have asked me initially in my business, like, oh, well, you just have someone that like gives you to-dos and deadlines, I would have been like, oh, I'll never roll like that. But it's like the best thing. So yeah, I think kind of, yeah. Molly says, I like hiring people who are more talented than me at whatever it is, and that helps me let go of micromanaging or being in control. I think that's probably true in a sense, and I love that that feels good for you. Like for me, I love that it's even bigger than the person, if that makes sense, because it makes me feel really like anyone on our team, like I want them to like have the freedom they want to have. I want them to explore what they want to explore. Like I was mentioning earlier, we had a team member that was with us for 4 or 5 years and then left. Like I want her to be able to do that. And I want to not feel like attached to that. Like, not that we don't want someone to stay or love them or care about them, but I want it to feel like our business is bigger than the person. You know, even me, like I want it to feel like our business is bigger than just that. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think both can fit together.
I'm totally with you on that too, because I feel like, I also think that like really like placing kind of like the trust and the focus in the systems really almost like allows the team members to really like shine within that role, but then also feel like, you know, it's not like we're dependent on them for like, if they can't take time off or something like that. Like the system still supports for them, like to take a week off and go on vacation, and the business will still continue to run and function. And then like the system kind of supports almost like more freedom in that sense, and like gives
Exactly.
like everybody a little bit more like flexibility to have like more space to work within that.
Okay, so we're kind of coming up on time and we kind of didn't get into as many specifics. So maybe we'll save that for March. In February, we're going to do all of our team members and what they do. But I love these questions. That was not like a negative thing at all. You guys are the best. And we are 1000% here for that more than anything else.
Yes.
But we'll stack that into March, and we'll maybe get into some of the more specifics, because we were going to talk about like sales processes. We're going to talk about a little bit about offboarding, things like that. So we can do that then. But yes, you are entered to win the content bundle if you commented. If not, we can drop a link for that. And then also check out Megan's whitespace.team website, where she has a ton of systems for this too. If you're like, I'm just craving that right now, we got you. If you have NFT questions, I will be back next week to talk all things NFT. I think that's it.
Yeah, I think we're good.
All right. Love you guys. Megan, thank you for being here. As always, you are like a wealth of knowledge, and I'm just so grateful for you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Thanks
for coming,
guys.